If you're watching this video, you're probably a massive nerd like me who cares about stupid shit like weapon tier lists in PvE games. But I'm not here to discuss the relevance or significance of tier lists. I just want to clear up any misconceptions around the relative strength of weapons in Sunbreak in a freestyle speedrun format, which may have been created because of this so-called DPS ratio. Since you're watching this, I assume you're aware of what the DPS ratio is, and that you probably watched Fox Invictus's latest bar chart race. This bar chart race is a fun little infographic, but in terms of actual relevance or accuracy, I'd say it's not great. It's got nothing to do with how Fox compiled the data for the charts, but has more to do with how representative this data is of weapon strength. So, the DPS ratio is taken from the freestyle leaderboard. The formula behind it is very simple. It will take the average time across all weapons for a certain quest, and assign that to a ratio of 1 in terms of DPS. Then any weapon faster than that time will get a larger number, and any weapon slower than that time will get a smaller number. The numbers assigned to a weapon across all its quests are then averaged to give the DPS ratio metric. This DPS ratio isn't an accurate measure of weapon strength for a number of reasons. If you look at the leaderboard, not every quest has been run with every weapon, because runners might not be interested in stuff like Basarius with dual blades, or shredding 1 stars with heavy bowgun in 10 seconds. So this creates holes in the dataset. And for example, say you have a monster that's only been run by HPG and Hunting Horn. The ratio will be super skewed in favor of HPG, and when this is factored into the overall DPS ratio, it creates a sort of distortion which makes APG look even faster than it is and Hunting Horn look even slower than it is. There are further flaws in the dataset even with quests that have been run with every weapon. Many of the times submitted to this leaderboard have not been run the latest update with the latest balance patches and power creep, and to be honest, many of the runs that are considered world records on this leaderboard are far from optimal times. For example, take my super shitty Aurora Somnicat Switch-Axe run. I did this in base Sunbreak, and during this time I had no idea how to properly script a speedrun. Theoretically, if someone did a good Title Update 3 run for this, it would be 1 minute 20 something instead of 1 minute 50 something. Furthermore, many runners who may have world records don't really give a shit about submitting runs to the leaderboard. In the past, the previous admin Fox Invictus would actively go and add every speedrun he could find to the leaderboard to try and create a more complete dataset of speedrun times. Our current administration and judging team, we've decided that we'll just let runners submit their own runs if they want to compete in the leaderboard. I watch and follow a lot of speedrunners, and I've seen a bunch of insane Title Update 3 runs that aren't included in the DPS ratio as the runner does not want to submit to the leaderboard. In these cases, it'll mean that the DPS ratio will be lower than it should be. So, how can we gauge the relative strength of weapons in freestyle speedruns if the DPS ratio is inaccurate? Well, unfortunately, we'll never have a complete and accurate dataset, but I'll try my best to create a more accurate but likely subjective tier list. Basically, I'll go through all the weapons and explain my thoughts on them having watched, judged, and done many speedruns. Unfortunately, my knowledge will be incomplete as I have less understanding of some weapons, but I'll still try my best to be accurate and give a clear explanation behind each ranking. And I'll link some channels of runners I know in the description so you can see what a weapon is really capable of. As the DPS ratio and bar chart race are meant to cover TU3 runs, I'll also explain changes made in this update and how they affect each weapon. So one thing I need to cover before discussing the weapons is perhaps the biggest TU3 change, the dog balance changes. Silk binders have been nerfed severely with damage halved and status application reduced by 80%, and dual chain dogs were highly buffed in terms of element damage. This has had differing impacts on different weapons, with every weapon losing a couple free CCs, but most weapons benefiting overall because of increased damage output. What's really silly is that these dual blade chain element dogs do so much damage that some weapons adapt the playstyle to the dogs. Certain moves on each weapon make the dogs do a spinning chain attack that hits so hard that optimal DPS combos have changed because you need to take the dog's damage into consideration. One more thing to keep in mind is that this list only covers up until TU3. Since TU4 has dropped with all the new skills and new power creep, we may see significant changes to this list going forward, but I just wanted to set the record straight retroactively. So first off, I want to keep all the ranged weapons in their own tier because they are clearly stronger than melee weapons. HPG is absolutely cracked, LBG is also cracked, and bow is just a little bit less cracked. But if you've seen Fox's DPS race video, LBG seems to have caught up to HPG. This is not due to the weapon getting stronger, but it's mainly due to like one Japanese LBG player, Udon-chan. submitting a lot of really fast TU3 runs, whilst the top HPG runners haven't been as actively submitting to the leaderboards this update. HPG is actually even faster than the leaderboard would indicate because the leaderboard bans the multi-shot glitch, which is absolutely busted. Like, if you count runs using the glitch, HPG will be way ahead of any other weapon. It'll be up in its own tier, somewhere up here. As for bow, the introduction of Strive 3 and its infinite stamina buff is pretty insane. A lot of bow runs I see recently use Berserk 1 and Scroll Swap twice to quickly get max Strife, and combine this with Armor Hose to also get a huge raw boost early in the hunt. A good player to watch using this in action would be Eddie Weekly. So the strongest melee weapon for every update so far has been Greatsword. It's pretty obvious why. Strong arm stance is a disgustingly strong counter in a game that has been built around counters. Against shit ones, Greatsword could just trap, barrel bomb, TCS a few times and capture. Against endgame monsters, strong arm gives access to an omnidirectional counter that does insane damage. I don't think anyone would dispute that Greatsword's the strongest weapon. Well, strongest melee weapon. Greatsword has also historically been a weapon that benefits much less from palamutes than other weapons, so some runners even choose to run double cats, and this means that the recent changes have barely affected Greatsword's strength. Now here's where it gets controversial. In terms of the DPS ratio, this weapon is apparently 4th slowest, but I believe it's firmly in top tier now. Longsword received a gigantic buff in the form of Wind Mantle. The Y-bar cooldown improvement this gives is insane, because it can now continuously spam serene poses with some EIs in between. For some endgame monsters, Longsword can get better times than Greatsword because of how fast, versatile, safe, and spammable its counters are. It can counter multi-hit moves like no other weapon can. Even if Greatsword can get 5000 damage on a strong arm, it has to wait until the end of a monster's combo to do so, whilst Longsword can counter every hit of the combo. Longsword's counters also connect and do damage instantaneously, which makes them effective on almost every move a monster does. A lot of other weapons such as Switch Axe and Charge Blade can't counter a monster jumping or running past them, whilst Longsword can. If you want to see what times Longsword can get in TU3, you can check out Finks' channel. His TU3 Longsword times are almost as fast as Greatsword times. His run on Risen Teostra is actually faster than the best Greatsword runs I've seen. So, why isn't Longsword top tier in the DPS ratio? It's simply because the best players haven't submitted their runs. Furthermore, I rarely see the best players run low tier monsters. There are some runs on the leaderboard for these, but a lot of them are very outdated or suboptimal. It is true that Longsword could inherently be weaker against shit ones who are less aggressive, thus giving less counter opportunities, but as the game continues to be updated and new monsters get stronger, faster and more aggressive, Longsword will only improve. Also, Sacred Cheats exist. The dog changes have also benefited Longsword. As a counter-based weapon, paralysis from gun dogs was basically DPS loss before, and the new chain dogs and their superior damage work well with Longsword. As you can see in this clip, every single counter makes him do the spinning move, which is absolutely busted. So next on the list is Switch Axe or swaxe. It is always set around here in the higher tiers, which is where it belongs. Swaxe is a very versatile weapon, not in terms of playstyle, which is pretty uniform across matchups, but in terms of damage output across different hit zones. Power files are great for raw damage, and element files are great for element damage. With build-up boost being added to the augment pool, and how it interacts with exhaust files, swaxe has even gained a good CC option, albeit one that does slightly less damage. The main strength of swaxe is its consistent and very high damage output that comes from the Morph Loop combo. Swaxe also has a good counter too, but it's not as good as Greatsword or Longswords. It does less damage than Strong Arm or Serene Pose, and it swings in such a wide arc that it often connects with shit zones for a lot of a monster's moveset. The long windup also means it can't be used reactively on a lot of moves, but it's still a strong move with great utility in the form of instant amp. The main impact of TU3 on swaxe were the dog changes. Swaxe was one of the weapons that benefited most from the free paralysis because it meant you could just mash out morph loops and do shitloads of damage. The dual chain dogs are also not that strong on swaxe compared to some weapons. They'll only do the chain spin move on a successful counter or a ZSD. The problem is that the monster's usually moving during these moves, so the dogs might whiff. But overall, that's all I have to complain about. Swaxe is still good because it just does a lot of damage in general. On to the other weapon that has remained in high tier all this time, and will continue to remain in high tier, Charge Blade. Strive 3 for SAD is huge. Charge Blade is even stronger now on element weak monsters, because SADs just hit 20% harder. Another benefit that the SAD playstyle received was from the dog changes. The dogs did a spinning chain move on every SAD, and SAD wasn't reliant on paralysis from Silkbinders before, so it just gained a ton of free damage. Unfortunately for Axehopper, it does not trigger the dog spinning chain move, so it's become relatively weaker and has not seen much use in freestyle speedruns since. However, whilst Chargeblade became much stronger on element weak monsters, it has struggled in comparison on monsters that have poor elemental hit zones. Impact SAD is still dogshit in Sunbreak, so CSS is the main option for raw damage output. In base Sunbreak, CSS was actually stronger than SAD, as it was able to exploit paralysis, mount and KOs for CC whilst running Adrenaline. Since then, SAD has gained huge amounts of element, while CSS has lost the free paralysis from dogs. CSS is also one of the least mobile playstyles in Sunbreak, and is difficult to play against endgame monsters when they're able to fight back. The worst part is that Ready Stance, a key part of the main CSS combo, makes dogs defend themselves instead of attacking, meaning CSS loses a lot of free dog damage. If I were to treat Chargeblade as two separate weapons, SAD would be above Switchaxe in elemental matchups, while CSS would fall down the next tier or possibly even lower due to how much free damage it loses because of the silly dog changes. The next weapon on the list, Dual Blades, received a massive buff in Tier U3. Spiral Slash was basically given 20% more damage. Since Dual Blades are so element heavy, this combined with Strife gave it a huge DPS increase. This can be seen in the bar chart race video, but these DPS ratio changes only took into account a limited number of Tier U3 runs. With such a massive buff, Dual Blades can easily be moved up into the strong tier. Dual Blades does kind of suffer from similar issues to Chargeblade, in that it's inherently weaker in matchups where monsters don't have good elemental hit zones. However, one advantage that Dual Blades have is that it's easier to aim its attack to small hit zones than SAD files. This means that Dual Blades can actually target hit zones that would be unconventional or impossible for other weapons, such as the forelegs of Valstrax or Mizutsune. Obviously you can't Spiral Slash these since raw hit zones are bad, but chopping the feet with Demon Flurry Rush or Blade Dance can do some huge white number damage. Also, Spiral Slash and Blade Dance both make the dogs do the spinning chain attack, which is great. Not much else to say here, a 20% buff to your main damage move is nuts. Rest in peace, Piercing Bind. Sword and Shield really likes Wind Mantle and really likes the dog changes. This is all because of Metsu Shoryugeki. Metsu, like any other good Silkbind move, makes the dogs do the spinning chain attack. The loss of free paralysis from Silkbinder dogs does not matter to SNS, with the ability to easily KO and mount monsters with Metsu, and the utility of placing traps without shielding, SNS can freely CC any non-Elder Dragon for a quick and easy capture. For Elders that you can't just trap, Wind Mantle gives SNS a lot more opportunities to use Metsu, which means more damage and more KO. However, because SNS is so reliant on Metsu, there are a few matchups that aren't great for it, such as Diablos of Chameleos, where the monster's movesets are hard to counter unless you run Windmill, which is less damage and less KO. A monster like Chameleos is also an issue because of its poor raw hit zones. SNS actually has very low elemental damage output, not only because shield attacks do no elemental damage, but even its sword loops are more raw oriented. Overall, SNS's lockdown ability combined with how effectively it utilizes dogs make it very strong across the majority of matchups, which is why I believe it belongs in strong tier. You can check out Professor X aka Savage Diablo's channel to see just how strong SNS is in Tier 3. Next is Hammer. Many of you may have been surprised by how much Hammer has moved up on that DPS ratio chart, as there has been a common conception that Hammer was a shit weapon since beating of Sunbreak. I think Hammer did have a slow start because everyone was still in the Impact Creator Copium and had not yet become accustomed to Hammer's new playstyle, with stronger charge attacks and vastly improved courage style, which now dominates Hammer's speedruns. However, the largest factor behind Hammer's progress this update is, of course, the dog balance changes. Very little has changed for the weapon itself. All that happened is that it's gained a free 20% DPS. Previously, Silkbinder dogs on Hammer provide some CC through paralysis, but in terms of damage they only contributed about 10 to 15% of total DPS at most. Hammer has no issues locking down monsters on its own with KOs and flinches, but the new dual chain dogs can contribute over 30% of total DPS. This is because on every Hammer down, which is a third part of the courage combo, the dogs do the stupid spin attack. So through no merit of its own, Hammer has moved up to the bottom of strong tier. Lance is a good, well-rounded weapon. When the monster is moving and attacking, it is a powerful counter and cross sweep, and Anchor Rage stacked to the offensive guard gives a huge raw boost. When the monster is recovering or CC'd, Lance can output solid elemental damage with leaping thrust spam, or raw damage with cross sweeps and spiral thrust. The issue is that in terms of reactive counter-based damage, Lance is nowhere near as strong as Greatsword, Longsword or SAED Charge Blade, and for proactive damage for when it wants to CC'd, it's not as strong as Swaxe or Dual Blades. And in terms of the third important metric, dog damage, it only gets the spin move on Anchor Rages. There are some specific matchups where Lance excels. These are ones with giant monsters that are easy to hit with Skyward Thrusts. For example, Lance has a disgusting ledge cancel tech on Nawa that lets it get really fast times. However, across its general matchup spread, Lance doesn't do enough damage to be in strong tier, but it's still definitely good. So onto the bad weapons. Well, I don't actually think Insect Glaive is bad. I think it's good. This is another weapon where not many runners have touched the shit ones, and some of the best runners don't bother submitting the runs to the leaderboard. So one thing that distinguishes Insect Glaive and these other low tier weapons from the top tier ones is its perception that they don't have a good counter in a counter focused game. However, with the Glaive, the dominant playstyle in Sunbreak uses Kinsect Flash and Diving Wyvern, which basically lets you ignore the monster's moves and combos if you get into the right rhythm. It's functionally the same as a counter in that you damage the monster while it's attacking. Glaive excels in maintaining DPS. This doesn't matter on shit mons that can slap around and keep constantly CC'd, but being able to keep attacking a mobile or aggressive monster and have more windows to exploit compared to some other weapons is useful. Unfortunately, Diving Wyvern does not proc the dog spin move, however, Tetris Seal Slash does. If you've noticed Glaive players changing the grounded combos on a CC'd monster, this is why. But overall, Glaive's damage output just isn't comparable to the strong weapons, and I do think it's weaker than Lance in general, but maybe not a whole tier below. I think the weapon belongs in good tier. Now we have everyone's favourite weapon to complain about, Gunlance. Gunlance has undergone an interesting transformation in TU3. In TU2 the main playstyle involved blast dashing behind the monster to spam sneak attack full bursts to try and actually have shunning damage scale. Sometimes you would see Adrenaline Slap Lance or Adrenaline in full burst without sneak attack, but this would only be reserved for monsters that are difficult to get behind or just have absurdly high raw hit zones. In TU3 the reduction in Hailcutter's Wyvern cost has made it the new main move to spam. This has also opened up some other options for Gunlance. Wyvern Fire can now be used much more frequently since Hailcutter reduces its cooldown, and Hailcutter's raw damage makes Adrenaline more impactful for the weapon. Both Hailcutter and Wyvern Fire also make the dog spin. Being able to augment shelling levels is also a nice addition, and these changes have made many more Gunlances viable. However, the weapon still suffers from the issue that having a lot of damage that can't scale sucks. On monsters with both low raw and low element hit zones, Gunlance can almost keep up with other weapons, but the higher a monster's hit zones go, the more other weapons pull away. At this point in time, very few Gunlance runs use Adrenaline, so there is some extra damage to be squeezed out of the weapon. But overall, Gunlance still isn't good from a freestyle tier list point of view. It's not sad or bad either, but it's just okay. Now, on to the last weapon. I'm gonna spoil it and say, Hunting Horn's not sad, because I can see the fun in playing it, but it's not OP, strong or good or okay either, it's probably bad. Maybe Capcom thought it wouldn't be fair to give the support weapon actual damage. I've recently tried to pick up Hunting Horn and from what little I understand about it, is that the swings don't hit that hard even though they're slow. Supine Shockwave and Beat Resonance both only last 30 seconds and barely do damage in activation. For comparison, Hammer's Impact Burst lasts 60 seconds and does decent damage in activation. And the weapon's overall design and moveset seems to want you to super armor through moves with Silkline Shockwave, which makes it difficult to play Adrenaline when you can't afford to use that option. Infernal Melody takes a while to build and only lasts 20 seconds. Even with it active, Hunting Horn does less damage than strong tier weapons. The dogs do get buffed for Hunting Horn, but they're not actually that strong with it compared to Hammer or Dual Blades or Sword and Shield. They'll only do their spin move if you use Magnificent Trio. But this is all massive skill issue and cope from me. One real issue with Hunting Horn is that many of its runners aren't actively running. I'd like to see some more Hunting Horn runs. Maybe the weapon is stronger than what the DPS ratio or I think. So here it is. My final theoretical, subjective and arbitrary, but probably much more accurate than the DPS ratio tier list. I just want to reiterate that no LBG has not overtaken HBG, and yes, Longsword and Hammer are that strong. And most importantly, no. This list has absolutely no bearing on casual hunts and only applies to freestyle speedrun times. This video took longer than I expected to complete, but now that I've had a few days to play around with TU4 and see what the skills do, I believe that the list will change a lot going forward. Frostcraft is absolutely cracked for Greatsword, and it's very strong for most scripted runs for dual blades and sword and shield. Not sure about longsword yet though. The huge amounts of elements we got will also greatly benefit charge blade and dual blades. Over the course of this update, I would expect the gap between the strongest and the weakest weapons to grow due to selective power creep, but at this point in time, nothing is certain.